Have you ever wondered how to recognize when someone is under the devil's influence? We're not talking about possession, that extreme case where evil takes direct control of a person's body, but something far more subtle and much more common, influence itself. Exorcists tell us that the devil has a very specific personality, filled with hatred, pride, lies, and despair. And when someone, through carelessness or rebellion, opens themselves to this action, they begin to mirror these traits. It's as if the enemy leaves invisible marks on their character, signs that manifest in attitudes, words, and reactions. That's why, yes, it's possible to discover when someone is acting under his inspiration. If you believe in Padre Pio's spiritual wisdom and want his protection against evil influences, write in the comments, "Padre Pio, protect me from evil." Your faith can be a shield for others who read your testimony. Today, I'm going to show you the behaviors and signs that allow us to identify the devil's influence in people's lives. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover could change the way you see those around you, and also the way you see yourself. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, a saint marked by suffering and spiritual warfare, knew the devil face to face. He was struck by him, dragged across the floor, tempted with horrible thoughts, tormented with noises, nauseating smells, and visions of terror. However, he never gave in. He knew how to clearly discern when a soul was under the influence of evil and warned his spiritual children that Satan acts very cunningly, infiltrating little by little. He said, "The devil is like a rabid dog on a chain. If you don't get close, he won't bite. But if you get too close, he destroys." But what exactly are these signs that show us the influence of evil? This isn't about obsession or seeing the devil in everything, but about being attentive, vigilant. As St. Peter urges us in his letter, "Be alert and of sober mind." Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. 1 Peter 5:8. The signs I'm about to reveal aren't just theoretical concepts. They're real patterns that spiritual directors, exorcists, and saints like Padre Pio have identified through centuries of spiritual warfare. These aren't meant to create fear, but to arm you with knowledge. Because when we can recognize the enemy's tactics, we can defend ourselves and help others break free from his subtle chains. Are you ready to discover what Padre Pio knew about recognizing evil's influence? Let's begin with the first unmistakable sign. Throughout his life, Padre Pio experienced direct attacks from the devil that went far beyond what most of us could imagine. The enemy would physically assault him, leaving visible marks on his body. Witnesses heard terrifying screams coming from his cell at night, sounds that weren't human. The devil would appear to him in disgusting forms, fill his room with putrid odors, and try to break his spirit with blasphemous temptations. Yet through all these attacks, Padre Pio never wavered in his faith. He learned to recognize the enemy's voice, his tactics, and his influence on souls. This wasn't theoretical knowledge for him. It was lived experience earned through decades of spiritual combat. The devil, Padre Pio would tell his spiritual children, is like a rabid dog on a chain. If you don't get close to him, he can't bite you. But if you venture too close, he will tear you apart. This wasn't said to frighten, but to warn. He understood that the devil's greatest weapon isn't his roar. It's his ability to convince us he doesn't exist. Padre Pio had what spiritual directors call the gift of discernment of spirits. He could look at a person and immediately sense whether they were under spiritual attack, living in grace, or somewhere in between. Penitents would come to confession with him, thinking they could hide their sins or their spiritual state, only to have Padre Pio reveal exactly what was troubling their souls before they spoke a word. This gift wasn't just supernatural intuition, it was earned through years of prayer, suffering, and intimate knowledge of how evil operates. He understood that Satan rarely works through dramatic possessions or obvious manifestations. Instead, he prefers subtle influence, slowly poisoning thoughts, gradually hardening hearts, and carefully leading souls away from God's light. As St. Peter warned the early Christians, and as Padre Pio would remind his spiritual children, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. 1 Peter 5:8. The key word here is prowls. The devil doesn't announce himself. He stalks quietly, looking for weakness, for an opening, for just the right moment to strike. That's why recognizing his influence is so crucial for every believer. Now let's dive into the actual signs that reveal when someone is under the devil's influence. Remember, these aren't meant to make us suspicious of everyone around us, but to help us recognize when someone, perhaps even ourselves, needs spiritual help. The first unmistakable sign is rejection of the sacred. When someone who once loved prayer suddenly can't stand being in church, when they feel uncomfortable around a crucifix, when they mock the Mass or feel anger at hearing Jesus' name, this is a red flag. The presence of the holy is clashing with a shadow that has taken residence in their heart. Think about Judas in the Gospel. He walked with Jesus for 3 years. He heard the Sermon on the Mount, witnessed the multiplication of loaves, saw the dead raised to life, yet somewhere along the way, he began to resent that divine presence. The light that once attracted him started to burn him from within. St. John tells us clearly, Satan entered into him, John 13:27. This is exactly what happens today. A person might have been devout, faithful, regular at Sunday Mass, then gradually they start making excuses. Church becomes boring. Prayer feels pointless. They might even become hostile toward religious conversations or feel physically uncomfortable in the presence of blessed objects. The devil cannot tolerate the sacred because it reminds him of what he lost forever. The second sign is contempt for the Virgin Mary. This one is particularly telling because the devil's hatred for Our Lady runs deeper than almost anything else. In the book of Genesis, God himself promised that she would crush the serpent's head, Genesis 3:15. The devil knows that Mary's humility destroyed his pride, and her yes to God reversed his rebellious no. Padre Pio never tired of praying the rosary. He called it his weapon. He would sleep with rosary beads in his fingers and recommended it to everyone who came to him. He used to say that Mary was the sure refuge against all temptations. Exorcists know that when they invoke the Virgin Mary during their work, demons tremble and scream with rage. So when someone feels repulsion toward the rosary, ridicules Marian devotion, or speaks badly of Our Lady, this is a very clear trail of diabolic influence. It's not a matter of different theological preferences or cultural backgrounds. There's something deeper happening when a person cannot tolerate the Mother of God. I remember hearing about a woman who had been a daily Mass attendee for decades. She had a beautiful statue of Our Lady in her garden and prayed the rosary every evening. Then slowly, things began to change. First, she started skipping the rosary, saying she didn't have time. Then she moved the statue of Mary to a closet because it didn't match her decor anymore. Finally, she began speaking sarcastically about all this Mary worship in her parish. Her family was confused. What had happened to their devout mother and grandmother? A wise priest recognized the pattern and helped her through prayer and the sacraments to break free from the subtle influence that had crept into her life. The third sign is despair, that profound sadness that leads a soul to believe there's no forgiveness, that their sins are too great, that it's no longer worth praying or fighting. The devil whispers in the ear, "You're worthless. There's no way out for you. God could never love someone like you." This is the same strategy used with Judas after his betrayal. The devil didn't just lead him to sin, he pushed him toward despair and suicide. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, just like Judas betrayed him. But Peter ran to mercy while Judas ran to despair. The difference wasn't in the gravity of their sins, but in their response to guilt. Padre Pio warned that fear and despair are the devil's weapons. Fear is worse than the devil himself because it paralyzes faith. In contrast, God's voice always invites us to mercy and calls us to rise again. Even when we've fallen badly, even when we've committed serious sins, God's voice says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. The voice of despair says, "It's over for you." The voice of God says, "Let's begin again." When someone is trapped in despair, unable to believe in forgiveness, convinced that their situation is hopeless, this often indicates that the enemy has gained a foothold in their thoughts and emotions. These first 3 signs, rejection of the sacred, contempt for Mary, and spiritual despair, often work together. They form a pattern that gradually separates a soul from the sources of grace and mercy that could heal them. But here's where we need practical weapons for spiritual warfare. You know, as I've been sharing about these spiritual battles, I can't help but think about the countless people who've asked me, how do I protect myself? What weapons did Padre Pio actually use? Well, just like Padre Pio relied on the rosary as his primary weapon against these very attacks we're discussing, we too need that same spiritual armor. That's exactly why we created the ebook, The Power of the Rosary with Padre Pio, Miracles, Protection, and Divine Graces. This isn't just another prayer book. It's a complete spiritual warfare manual. You'll discover how to pray the rosary with the same devotion Padre Pio had, learn from actual testimonies of miraculous protection, and access his most powerful teachings about prayer. Plus, you'll get a 30-day prayer guide with daily intentions and special prayers for protection, healing, and liberation that Padre Pio himself recommended. The link is pinned in the comments, and honestly, after what we're about to cover next, you'll understand why this spiritual protection is so crucial, because the remaining signs we need to discuss are even more serious. The 4th sign of diabolic influence is slavery to sin. Now, all of us fall, all of us are tempted, but there's a difference between normal spiritual struggle and the chains that drag someone again and again into the same abyss, without strength to resist. St. Paul described this perfectly. "I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I practice." Romans 7:19. The devil takes advantage of our weaknesses to transform them into shackles. It might start as a simple temptation, a quick look at something we shouldn't, a small lie to avoid consequences, a moment of anger that we don't control. But gradually, what seemed like isolated incidents become patterns, then habits, then addictions. This isn't about occasional falls that we confess and try to overcome. This is about a person who feels completely powerless against certain sins, as if an invisible force keeps pulling them back no matter how hard they try to break free. They might cry after falling, promise themselves it will never happen again, even pray desperately for strength, yet find themselves repeating the same destructive behaviors. Padre Pio advised confessing even weekly because he understood that confession doesn't just erase sin, it breaks the invisible chains with which the evil one binds souls. He would tell his penitents, "The devil is like a fisherman. He throws his hook with attractive bait, but once you bite, he pulls you deeper and deeper until you can't find your way back to the surface." The 5th sign is hatred of the Eucharist. The Blessed Sacrament is the real presence of Christ, and the devil trembles before it. This is why when someone feels repulsion, mockery, anger, or even nausea when facing the altar, it's a sign of dark influence. During Mass, you might notice someone who can't stay still during the consecration, who feels compelled to leave the church at the moment of communion, or who experiences physical discomfort specifically during the Eucharistic prayer. This isn't about feeling bored during a long homily or being tired after a busy week. This is a visceral reaction to the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. Padre Pio spent hours before the tabernacle, crying, offering, struggling. He would celebrate Mass in such a way that people could see he was in direct contact with the divine mystery. He knew that there was the source of victory against evil. He once said, "It would be easier for the world to survive without the sun than to do without Holy Mass." The devil knows this. That's why he works so hard to keep people away from the Eucharist, to make them feel unworthy of communion, to create distractions during the most sacred moments of the Mass, or to fill them with skepticism about the real presence. The sixth sign is the manifestation of strange phenomena, night noises, shadows that move, pestilent smells without explanation, objects that fall by themselves, electronic devices that malfunction repeatedly in someone's presence. Padre Pio lived through all of this. The devil would bang on the walls of his cell, insult him with horrible voices, attack him physically. Fellow friars would hear furniture being thrown around in his room, only to find Padre Pio praying calmly the next morning, sometimes with new bruises on his body that he couldn't explain naturally. But here's what's crucial to understand. These phenomena don't happen in isolation. They typically occur around someone who is either in intense spiritual battle against evil, or someone who has opened doors to dark influences through occult practices, persistent grave sins, or rejection of God's grace. I once heard from a priest about a family who contacted him because their teenage son's room had become the center of disturbing activity. Pictures would fall from walls. His computer would turn on by itself, playing disturbing sounds. Visitors would feel an oppressive atmosphere when entering his space. When the priest investigated, he discovered the young man had been experimenting with Ouija boards and had developed an obsession with dark music and imagery that glorified evil. The phenomena weren't random. They were connected to choices that had opened spiritual doors that should have remained closed. Through prayer, fasting, confession, and removing all occult objects from the home, the family was able to restore peace. Exorcists say that when these manifestations appear around someone, it's a sign that there's a strong spiritual battle happening. The response isn't fear, but prayer, blessed water, the sign of the cross, and the invocation of Jesus' name. However, we must be wise here. Not every strange occurrence is diabolic. Sometimes there are natural explanations. Old houses make noises, electrical systems malfunction, people have medical conditions that affect their perceptions. The key is the pattern and the context. When these phenomena occur alongside other signs we've discussed, rejection of the sacred, inability to pray, spiritual despair, then we need to consider spiritual causes. Padre Pio taught that the devil prefers to work in darkness and secrecy. When his influence begins to manifest in visible ways, it often means the spiritual battle is intensifying. But this can actually be a good sign. It means the person's soul is fighting back, even if they don't realize it consciously. And now we come to the final three signs, and these might be the most dangerous of all. The seventh sign is the inability to pray. I'm not talking about normal laziness or tiredness that we all experience sometimes. This is a kind of revulsion, an almost unbearable weight, a physical impossibility of pronouncing a prayer. It's as if invisible hands were covering their mouth every time they try to speak to God. Saint Teresa of Avila said that when we don't feel like praying, that's exactly when we need to pray the most. But this goes deeper than not feeling motivated. This is about people who literally cannot form the words of prayer, who feel suffocated when they try to focus on God, or who experience panic attacks when they attempt to enter into prayer. The devil knows that prayer is our lifeline to heaven. It's through prayer that we receive grace, strength, and guidance. Cut off that connection, and a soul becomes spiritually malnourished and vulnerable to every temptation. That's why one of his primary tactics is to create barriers between us and God in prayer. Padre Pio insisted, pray much, even when it costs you. The devil flees from persevering prayer. He understood that sometimes the greatest victories in prayer happen when it feels most difficult. The enemy fights hardest against what threatens him most. When someone finds themselves unable to pray, the solution isn't to give up, but to fight through it with simple, short prayers. Even just saying, Jesus, or help me, can break through the spiritual static that the enemy creates. The rosary becomes particularly powerful here because the repetitive nature of the prayers can help overcome the mental blocks that prevent deeper prayer. The eighth sign is irrational violence. The gospel tells us that the devil is a murderer from the beginning, John 8:44. When someone transforms, without apparent reason, into a whirlwind of hatred, screaming, insults, and destruction, it's as if a flame of fury has taken control from within. Now we need to be careful here. Mental illness is real. Psychological trauma can cause violent outbursts. Medical conditions can affect behavior dramatically. We're not suggesting that every angry person is under demonic influence, but sometimes the root goes deeper than psychology or chemistry. The violence we're talking about has certain characteristics. It often targets specifically religious objects or people. The person might be calm one moment and then explode with disproportionate rage when presented with a crucifix, holy water, or when someone begins to pray. The violence might be accompanied by knowledge they shouldn't have, strength beyond their normal capacity, or a voice that doesn't sound quite like their own. Padre Pio experienced this kind of irrational hatred directed toward him. People under strong diabolic influence would sometimes attack him verbally or even physically during confession, not because of anything he had done wrong, but because the evil within them couldn't tolerate his holiness. The response to this kind of violence isn't violence in return, but prayer, patience, and sometimes professional help that combines both psychological and spiritual approaches. Many times, what appears to be purely a mental health issue has spiritual roots that need to be addressed alongside medical treatment. And now we come to the ninth sign, perhaps the most dangerous of all: spiritual pride. Lucifer fell because he wanted to be like God, and he drags many souls down with the same deception. You don't need to confess, you don't need the church, it's just between you and God. This false autonomy is deadly poison. The person begins to believe they've evolved beyond the need for traditional religious practices. They might say things like, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I have a direct connection with God that doesn't require intermediaries. While this might sound humble or even enlightened, it often masks a deep pride. Padre Pio, humble to the point of tears, always obeyed the church, even when they humiliated him, when they prohibited him from celebrating Mass publicly, when they treated him unjustly. He understood that humility and obedience are the devil's greatest enemies. The devil cannot stand obedience or humility. When a soul distances itself from obedience to legitimate spiritual authority, it enters dangerous territory. Pride whispers, you know better than the church. You're more enlightened than these simple believers. You don't need their rules and regulations. This spiritual pride often develops gradually. Someone might start by questioning certain teachings, then rejecting the authority of their parish priest, then deciding they don't need the sacraments, and finally convincing themselves that they're their own spiritual authority. Each step seems reasonable in isolation, but together they lead a soul away from the protection and grace that come through the church. The antidote to spiritual pride is what Padre Pio practiced constantly: humility, obedience, and recognition of our complete dependence on God's grace. He would often say, I am nothing but a poor friar who prays. Despite his extraordinary spiritual gifts, his stigmata, and his fame throughout the world, he never stopped seeing himself as simply a servant of God and the Church. When we recognize these signs, whether in ourselves or others, the response isn't panic or judgment, but compassionate action. We pray for the person, we seek appropriate help, and we trust that God's mercy is stronger than any diabolic influence. But how do we actually fight back? Let me show you the weapons Padre Pio used every single day. My dear brothers and sisters, these are the signs we must watch with careful attention, not to judge or condemn others, but to pray, to help, and to open our eyes to spiritual realities around us. The devil wants to go unnoticed. He wants us to think he doesn't exist, that everything can be explained away by psychology or circumstance alone. But when we discover his tracks, we weaken his power over souls. And we have incredibly powerful weapons at our disposal. Frequent confession that breaks the chains of sin, the Holy Mass where heaven touches earth, the Rosary that terrifies demons, fasting that strengthens our spiritual muscles, holy water that sanctifies our homes, blessed medals that carry protection, and concrete acts of charity toward those most in need. Every one of these spiritual practices deals a blow to the enemy's influence. When we live sacramentally, pray consistently, and serve others sacrificially, we create an atmosphere where evil cannot take root. I want to invite you now to share in the comments if you've ever noticed any of these signs in your life or in someone close to you. Have you felt rejection towards sacred things? Have you struggled with despair? Have you witnessed strange phenomena in your home? Your testimony in the comments could help others recognize what's happening in their own lives and seek the help they need. Also, please share your prayer intentions with our community. We are a spiritual family, and your needs will be carried in the prayers and rosaries of many faithful souls who watch this channel. There's power when believers unite in prayer for one another. Share this video with someone who might need to hear these truths. Maybe there's someone you love who is under a dark influence and needs to understand what's happening to them. Do this out of charity, out of love for souls who are suffering and searching for answers. Remember always, Christ has already won the victory. The devil can roar, he can deceive, he can create chaos, but he is defeated. And whoever holds Mary's hand never gets lost. Padre Pio knew this truth and lived it every day of his life, even through the most intense spiritual battles. You too can experience this victory over evil. Don't be afraid of the spiritual battle. Be prepared for it. Heaven is promised to those who persevere in faith, and no force of hell can snatch you from God's hands if you remain faithful to him. Before you go, I want to ask for your help in spreading Padre Pio's wisdom to more souls who desperately need this spiritual guidance. We're building a community of believers committed to sharing the truth about spiritual warfare and God's protection. If this message touched your heart, please hit the like button. It helps more people discover these life-changing teachings. Share this video with your family and friends who need spiritual strength, and consider becoming a channel member to support our mission of bringing Padre Pio's wisdom to souls around the world. Together, we can be instruments of God's light in a world that desperately needs hope and truth.